So welcome everybody to the January 2024 talk for the Cascade Mycological Society with tonight's invited guests, Heather Dawson and her wonder dog, Truffle dog, Rye. So Heather's graduated the U of O recently with a degree in biology, a BS in biology, and she's working at the Biddy Roy Mycological Lab. And she started out truffling with another dog, Cricket, and focusing mostly on culinary truffles. Are people familiar with the Oregon culinary truffles? If you're not, Heather will fill us in tonight. And her second dog she's trained is here tonight, Rye. And she's trained Rye to be a diversity truffle dog. And that's what her talk is about tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Heather Dawson and her dog, Rye.
Well, thanks for coming out. I hope everyone's excited to see some truffles, learn about truffles, and hear a little bit about truffle dog training. So my talk is titled, Wait, Don't Eat the Truffle, Truffle Dog Training and Dog Pound Truffle Diversity. If you've ever trained a truffle dog or been out, you know, sometimes it's a challenge getting to the truffle before they do. So why hunt truffles with a dog? Well, this is a picture of me and my first dog, Cricket. The first day she had her real truffle find. One of the happiest days of my life. It was a very special day. There are many reasons to go truffle hunting with a dog, but for me, this is the big one. So it's actually a team of us. I was originally going to give this talk with my sister, Hillary Rose, but she's in Australia working on her postdoc. So it's just me here today. These are the dogs. Cricket was my first. She loved black truffles. She did a little diversity, not a bunch. But then I got Rye, and Rye he went wild finding all the different truffle aromas out there. And he's a very special dog. I am training another truffle dog. He's still a puppy right now. We'll see if he does as good as Rye. His name's Pyro, and right now he really just likes eating truffles. So we'll see. Oh, got it. Thank you. Okay, brief outline of my talk. Part one, we're going to talk a little bit about truffle dog training, if you want to train your own dog. Part two is what are truffles? And part three, I'll take you through the Pacific Northwest truffle diversity and some of the great things that Rye finds. Part one, truffle dog training. So people ask me how I got into training truffle dogs and hunting truffles with a dog. For me, I can't imagine anything better than being in the woods, hunting fungi, and having my dog be a part of it. So it's pretty much a match made in heaven, and I think a lot of other people like it too. How do you train a truffle dog? First, you have to condition them to associate the truffle aroma with something they really, really like. For Rye, that's a ball. He's a ball dog, so he goes crazy for a ball. Most dogs like treats. You want something really stinky, something they're going to remember. And you start out by just showing it truffle aroma. It can be oil, it can be frozen truffle. Show them that, say yes, give them their treat. Then they'll start to associate that truffle smell with something they like. Then you can put it on the ground. They're probably going to be curious. They'll head towards it. As soon as they go towards the truffle, again, give them that reward. Say, yes, here's your treat. Here's your ball, whatever you want. I do recommend you start with food first, even if you have a ball dog. It's just easier to make that quick association. Then you can start, hiding it around the house, making it a fun game. Keep it short and easy. Usually you can just like tuck it under the rug a little bit. Most dogs love this game. They will go crazy for it. Then you can take it on the road. This is where you might see some challenges. I recommend going to something familiar like your backyard first before you go to the forest. You can just take a little stick or something, dig a tiny hole in the ground, stick your truffle bait in there, and send your dog out to find it. Keep it fun, keep it easy. Remember that going outside is a really big step for the dog. It's really different than finding it indoors where, the scent of home is kind of like white noise. They don't have to think about much else. Once you go outside, there's all kinds of other things they're going to get distracted by. That's especially true for the forest because the forest smells like fungi. I mean, we can hardly imagine what the forest must smell like to a dog with, their fine-tuned nose. So be very forgiving. If you go to the forest and your dog has no interest in finding truffles, it just means you've gone too fast. Some common problems, you'll probably encounter problems, everyone does, I have. Your dog might just start randomly digging holes. You think they've got a truffle, you don't find anything. They may be just confused about what causes the reward. They think, oh, I smell a truffle, but you're not rewarding me, so I'm going to keep moving on. You need to be really clear that it's the act of their nose getting close to the truffle, showing you where it is that causes the reward. So spend time being really precise. Use your words, your reward marker, that yes word, to tell them, yes, you found it, it's right there. And then you can give them the treat. I've made a mistake of, my dog digs and I think, oh, there's a truffle. We have to find it. Come on, come back. Show me the truffle. That just stresses them out. If they're not interested, just move on. This is probably the biggest problem you'll encounter. Your dog doesn't want to find truffles. And you're out there in the forest like, come on, I brought you out here. Let's find some truffles. And they'd rather go follow the deer trails. It's mostly just a case of going too fast. Not reading your dog, not understanding they're a dog, they've got their own interests. You can never go wrong by taking a step backwards. Just go back to the house, go back to the backyard. When you are in the forest, just one find at a time. Hide your truffle, make a big deal when they find it, and let them be a dog. Don't, if you put pressure on them, it'll stop being a game and they'll stop being interested. Then there's this problem. I have this problem with my puppy. He really likes truffles. He especially really likes black truffles, and he eats them on a regular basis. Good way to practice not eating the truffle is keep truffle pieces in a container. Anytime they get a taste for truffles, you can't make them forget that. They'll probably keep eating truffles. You don't want to correct them or yell at them for eating it, because then they'll stop being interested in truffles. You don't want that either. So a lot of times, just try to be faster than your dog, get that food in their face the instant they pull out the truffle. And it's fun. It's a game. If they eat a truffle, it's not the end of the world. There is a shortcut. If you don't want to start, all the way from the beginning, if you know someone with a truffle dog, ask pretty please to go out with them and find a truffle, because if their dog finds one, just have them pull their dog off that spot and you can point to it and tell your dog, there's a truffle right there. You can find it. Because that's the hard part for the dogs, is actually getting the location. Once they're told where it is, it's generally pretty easy. And that's how Rye was trained, and he picked it up instantly. Now, how do you actually find real wild truffles? It took me a few years. I really struggled with cricket. It was not instant. I didn't just find a patch of forest and like, woohoo, there's some truffles. We had to really keep at it. If you know someone who has Douglas fir forest, ask them if you could take your dog out, and just keep checking places out. Be patient with your dog. Always bring something with you so they can be successful. How do you find truffle habitat? Most important is you need to know your trees. Truffles are mycorrhizal, which means they're root symbionts with their tree hosts. And in our area in the Pacific Northwest, you generally want to look under oak trees and conifers in the pine family. Specifically, our culinary truffles are only with conifers. Some truffle species are really going to be specific with what trees they associate with, others not so much. It just depends. Worth noting, you don't need to look under maples. You don't need to look under trees in the cypress family. Those are not going to host truffles. Culinary truffles, which is generally where people want to start, you need to look for Douglas fir, which is pretty darn easy to find. We've got a lot of Douglas fir around here. We especially have a lot of Douglas fir plantations. And believe it or not, these, tight-knit, pure Douglas fir stands, young, pretty artificial forests, that's where you're going to find the highest truffle abundance. A lot of these forests are private. Be very careful. You need to check whether you're allowed to be harvesting there. Truffle harvesting does need a permit. So I wish I could give you an easy answer about the permit system. I can't. It's quite complicated, but do your own research. Again, knowing people who have these forests is the way to go. White truffles, you want to look for just a complete absence of any ground cover. That's the prime white truffle habitat. Black truffles we typically find with that sword fern undercover. They like a little more dampness in the soil. So just keeping an eye out for those kind of forests, you start to get a sense of what you're looking for. Now, not everyone has a dog. You can go rake for truffles. I personally don't recommend raking for truffles on a commercial basis because it does a lot of damage to the forest. I have seen what truffle poaching looks like, and it's not good. But if you're just curious and you don't have a dog, you can do it sustainably. You know, with a truffle rake, you peel back that upper organic layer, the duff, kind of dig around, you know, just in those first couple of inches. The white truffles will pop out, be very easy to see. Other truffles might not be. And then, you know, you don't find anything, just try to make it look like the way it was before you dug it up. If you leave those tree roots exposed, you're potentially introducing pathogens to the trees. So just be mindful. Okay, part 2. So what are truffles? In the most simple terms, a truffle is an underground mushroom. Generally, on the outside, you'll have this protective skin. That's called the peridium. And the inside, we call the gleba. And between those white veins there, this is our Oregon white truffle, a tuber. Between those white veins are all the spores, many, many, many spores. So like all fungal fruiting bodies, the truffle is just the reproductive structure that carries the spores into the environment. Truffle spores are often ornamented with these warts or spines. They're actually really pretty, and that's to probably withstand the digestive tract of the animals they attract to eat them. So what exactly the word truffle means and includes really depends on the context you're in and who you're asking. If you read a scientific paper and it says something is a truffle, it's probably talking about everything in the genus tuber, which is our Oregon white truffles and all of the European culinary truffles. My talk today is on a lot more than that. You could say that anything that forms an underground fruiting body is a truffle. That kind of excludes a few because there are quite a number that are sort of in between underground and above ground. A common trait between all of these is usually that they've lost the ability to forcibly discharge their spores. So guild mushrooms, above ground mushrooms, they're able to propel their spores into the environment, be carried on the wind. Truffles don't do that. They're underground, they've lost that ability, and once they lose it, it seems to be permanently lost. So it's a pretty good characteristic to tell a truffle. But there's a few that actually still do discharge their spores, so it's tricky. I just say use whatever definition makes sense to you in the context you're using it in. For me, it's really what rye finds that has an aroma that's attracting animals. Now, why would you be a truffle? One of the biggest reasons is it offers protection from the elements. So when you're above ground as a fungus, you're mostly water. And you need that water to sustain, the functions of your reproductive structure, which means getting really cold, getting frozen is going to be limiting, and also drying out is a problem. When you go underground, you're protected from all of these things. This is just a little graph I made showing the temperature at the ground, at the top, and also the temperature 2 inches down, just for the month of March, which is typically a challenging time to be a mushroom because it's warming up, you're ready to fruit, but then you get these sudden hard freezes. And that potentially kills off your reproductive structure right as you put it up. If you check out that teal line in the middle, that's the minimum temperature, when it drops down at night, 2 inches underground, where most truffles hang out. It doesn't actually drop below 40 degrees compared to the bottom line. That's the minimum at the surface of the ground. It's routinely freezing. So soil protects you from cold stress and stress from drought, which is really common in our area as we get, this load of rain, the mushrooms come up and then it dries out and they're just stuck there. So truffles can persist a lot longer than mushrooms can because of that protection. As a bonus, it offers a different way to disperse your spores. So again, as I mentioned, above ground mushrooms forcibly discharge their spores into the air, and those spores are carried on wind currents. It's a pretty good way to carry your spores, but generally most of them don't go further than about a yard. You might get a few that go further on a nice windy day, but it's a limited area. Truffles are a little bit it's a little more risky being a truffle. You may not be found. Your spores may not go anywhere. But if you are found by a squirrel, there's a potential to go much, much further than when you have wind dispersed spores. So they produce aromas. They're hidden underground. And these squirrels or beetles, in the case, as you can see in this delicious black truffle that, we slice open and it just like bursts forth with beetles. Really common to see invertebrates there as well. But especially the mammals have a lot of potential to disperse these spores really great distances. So we like truffles because we think they smell good and they make our food taste better. This is a picture of our 3 main Oregon truffles. We've got the brown truffle, our winter white there, and the Oregon black truffle. And, depending on whether you like truffles, they're pretty good. I personally don't like the brown truffle, but I like both the other ones. There are hundreds of truffle species here in the Pacific Northwest. There's a reason we don't hear about them. They're not good to eat. They produce so many different aromas, all these different aromas that they've evolved to attract wildlife, and wildlife has different tastes than we do. Now, it's important to note that truffles aren't the only ones with fragrances. Anyone that goes out hunting mushrooms, you know that they have their own unique aromas, like the matsutake, which is known for its weird cinnamon, stinky gym sock smell. There's candy caps, which have that wonderful maple aroma once they're dried, and they go great in cookies and baked goods. Really interesting note that even if you have a super strong smelling mushroom, rye doesn't notice it. He passes right over it. That's not an aroma that he's looking for. And yet the truffles he finds, they come in all different aromas, fruity, rotting onions. We've got the tuber up there in the upper left. It smells like bleach and tomato. It doesn't smell good at all. He finds, this really common one. It's like burnt rubber and gasoline. Some of these are nice, and many of them I smell them once and I'm like, I never want to smell that again. Like really, really bad. But I didn't train him on all these smells. So how does he know that it's a truffle? I don't know. My theory is that there's, these common hidden aromatic compounds that he's able to use to tie these together and say that's a truffle. But I don't know. That's just a guess. He's done all the work figuring out what's a truffle, and I'm just excited every time he finds something new. So with so many truffles out there, how do you know what you found? Well, it's really hard. They're not like mushrooms. You can't just look at it and know what species you had. There's no books that are comprehensive about all the truffle species. You probably need a microscope to be certain about the species. And even beyond that, there's a lot of undescribed species out there. That's one of my main struggles when in my trying to figure out what truffle I have is I go to a key, I try to key out my truffle. Later on, I find out, okay, well, this wasn't in the key because it's not described. So you have to keep that in mind. That's true for mushrooms as well, but it's especially true for truffles because they're really hard to find. So they haven't been explored as thoroughly as mushrooms. Also important to note, truffle taxonomy has seen a lot of major revisions recently because we've been doing more DNA sequencing and finding out what we thought belonged to this family is actually in a completely different one. So what can you do if you find a truffle and you want it ID'd? One way to start is you can post it to iNaturalist. I highly recommend using iNaturalist for all your fungal finds. You can do it for plants, insects, birds. It's a great way to naturalize and really get to know stuff in your area local to you. iNaturalist has guides for learning how to use it if you haven't used it before. So you can, just Google how to use iNaturalist. And there is a Truffles of North America project. If you add your truffle find to that, you're more likely to get an ID because we've got truffle experts that keep an eye on that group. And in order to get an ID, we need pictures of all the parts of the truffle. So down there in the bottom, that was what the truffle looked like right as Rye dug it up and showed it. You would never be able to tell what kind of truffle that is. Once you slice it open, you get to see the gleba inside. You can see that's, kind of the way the pyridium comes in. That's a balsamia truffle. gets more obvious. So you need the outside, you need the inside for sure. Spores would be great, but no one's counting on spores. Scale bar is useful. You know, some of the truffles I find are like pinhead sized, others are fist sized. And the vegetation is very important because, as I mentioned, a lot of these are, you know, they're with specific trees, specific plants. And that's one way you can tell what species it is. And of course, if it has odor, don't forget to mention that. One note is this is actually a really affordable way to get fantastic close-up pictures of anything in the field. I use it for my truffles, but you know, anything to get detail. It's a 10x hand lens. You can find them online, very affordable. You can just hold it up against the lens on your phone camera and get close. And you can see the size of this truffle is about the size of my fingernail. And then the picture all the way on the right is the amount of detail I could get just with that hand lens and my cell phone. So people often ask me, what about poisonous truffles? Are there poisonous truffles? Are there ones you can't eat? It's kind of unknown. No one's fully explored all the truffles out there. The general thought is that if they're attracting mammals to eat them, they're probably not super poisonous. Don't count on that. Do your research. Never ever eat a mushroom just because you think it should be edible. The two you definitely need to watch out for are underground button mushrooms. So in their immature stage, amanine mushrooms can look like a little white truffle. If you slice it in half, you can see the beginnings of the gills and that stipe forming there. Definitely don't eat those. The false truffle scleroderma is one I very frequently see people saying, look, I found a truffle, we're going to eat it tonight. No, don't eat that. Scleroderma is very toxic. It will make you sick. It's usually quite solid on the outside, and before it turns powdery, it's got this black or purplish interior. And the ones I found actually smell quite nice, so never trust aroma. Moving on into some Pacific Northwest truffle diversity. We're going to see some of the beautiful truffles Rye finds. I've tried to stick to mostly common ones just to, you know, give an overview. And I've also included some of the really special rare ones that he finds that you'll probably never see, but are kind of exciting to go over. Now, as we go through this, keep in mind, everything here is found by Rye. I am not a good truffle hunter. There are people out there that are very good with a rake and they know how to find truffles and they find all this incredible diversity. I've never had to learn because I've got Rye, he shows me where all the truffles are. I showed him culinary truffles when he was just a few months old. And from there, he decided that he wanted to find other things. So he's the master. Every year he gets better. Every year he finds me new things and it's always exciting. So just a side note about finding truffle diversity. So there's, you know, rare mushrooms everywhere. And there's especially a lot unknown about truffles because they're so hard to find. In North America, you know, the truffle scientists here have pretty much exclusively used rakes. There's been a little bit more truffle dog research in Europe, but Rye is actually, he's kind of breaking ground here. So I'm always a proponent of why use a dog over a rake? There are pros and cons. The biggest things about using a dog is they don't have color or size bias. So when you're raking, you know, we're visual beings. We're going to see the bright white truffles, the big truffles, the ones that stand out. Many truffles out there are, you know, indeed smaller than my fingernail, and they look exactly like a clump of soil. I don't find them until Rye's nose points right out and says, that's a truffle. So I see a lot of things that people think are uncommon, but really they're just really hard to see. Another benefit of using a dog is they'll only get mature truffles. So truffles can stay developing underground for many months, and they don't have any odor. They're just biding their time, waiting for the right moment, you know, to produce that odor, to mature and be found by whatever squirrel or insect they're trying to attract. When they're mature, they have spores. And spores are really useful for figuring out what a species is and what general characteristics it has. It's less useful to find an immature truffle, which you're very likely to find with a rake. The other thing about using a dog is there's less ground disturbance. Rakes are a lot of trial and error. You look for these little digs that indicate something's been there, and you use your rake to dig around it. Maybe there's more truffles, maybe there's not. I don't have that very much with rye. He's not 100%. Sometimes he thinks he finds something and it's not actually there, but he runs around the forest and he'll precisely target where those mature truffles are. And he can cover a lot of area. If you're going out with a truffle, you're going to spend a long time in kind of, a human-sized range. But Rye's a dog, he moves fast and he can go really, really far. I'd say the main cons I've noticed with a dog, training investment, I love dog training. That's not a problem for me. Could be for some other people. Being vulnerable to environmental hazards is a really important one. Dogs can't work when it gets hot. As humans, we can seek shade, we can move slowly. They overheat really rapidly. So I have to be very mindful about not working him when it's getting warm. Over 60 degrees, he starts to pant. He's not going to smell as well while he's panting. 75 to 80 degrees, he's pretty much done. He's not going to be finding truffles. Rattlesnakes, I went down to Northern California and he had a rattlesnake encounter and I was like, oh, okay, we gotta watch out for rattlesnakes too. So, and cacti could be a problem. Again, you just gotta think about this is a dog, try to keep them out of trouble. Potentially you'd have to think about odor bias. If there are a lot of white truffles in an area, he's probably gonna be less interested in the not quite as smelly things. Still, I've been doing this for a couple of years and I found so many incredible truffles. I don't think that's a real con. But rakes, you can use them anywhere. They're not going to get sick. They're not going to get bit by rattlesnakes. But you still have to learn how to use them. So I'm pro dog. So when I walk through all these different slides, I've got them split up into the Ascomycete and Basidiomycete truffles. You don't really need to know the differences. It's just kind of the major divisions. Ascomycetes include our true culinary truffles, the tubers, and our black truffle. And Basidiomycete truffles are kind of just everything else. We don't usually eat them, but there's a lot of diversity. And these are the ones that are related to what we think of as mushrooms. So, your chanterelles, your boletes, pretty much everything out there except morels and cup fungi, which are in the Ascomycete group. Here's on the left, there's a few common Ascomycete truffles you might see in the woods. And on the right, those are their truffle relatives. So how did they get there? Most of them probably came from a cup stage. And, as the cup folds inwards, it gets tighter, more marbled, and it turns into what we think of as a truffle. This, of course, takes a very long period of time, but it is important to note that, all truffles did originally have above ground ancestors. So Ascomycete truffles, pretty much all of them are in this group we call the Pisizales, and that includes cup fungi, that includes our morels, and that is the truffle group. So I'll just walk through some of these. You don't need to know the names. Some of these, it is interesting to note what they're related to. So if you're familiar with elephant saddles, you can see the balsamia looks nothing like it. But that truffle there is more closely related to a helvella than it is to any other typical truffle you might think of. So you find a truffle and it's got that classic solid look, the marbled gleba. It's probably going to be in one of these three groups. Tuber is the classic. So we have so many species of tuber here in the Pacific Northwest. It's quite wonderful. This is my favorite genus. It's a boring one to have as favorite because it's just so common, but how can you not love them? They're beautiful. I find them in oaks, the ones on the left, I usually find in oaks, and then also our conifers host just an incredible diversity of tubers. And tuber gibosum there and tuber organense, those are our two culinary white truffles. The other ones here have interesting aromas, but they're not quite as suitable for the dinner plate. Coiromyces, this one is pretty uncommon. You're not likely to find this. I do find the one on the left reasonably frequently dry, but it's classically been an uncommon or rare truffle. So, if you are looking for it, high elevation conifer forests is where I typically find it. The one on the right is extremely uncommon. One of my favorite things I found. It's closely related to a European version, but Rya's found it twice. And it was just a special moment because I'd been searching for it for a long time. And when he found it, I knew exactly what it was. So that's a fun one. They look a lot like tuber. And then there's this balsamia truffle. These are beautiful. They have the red exterior. They're always warty. And inside they look like a tuber with those white veins. But there's less marbling. It's usually a little more homogeneous. And don't even try to key these out to species. It's practically impossible. Leucangium. So this is our culinary black truffle. Leucangium carthusianum is very common in our forests. You're likely to find it if you go towards the coast range. And we also have this, it's not an official name. It's been called the amaretto truffle. Smells just like a Leucangium carthusianum, the black one, but it's got beautiful like reddish purple exterior. And I mean, people have all these different ideas about what Leucangium smells like. It's actually quite a sweet truffle. It's more dessert-like than you'd expect. I like it shaved over vanilla ice cream. It's pretty good. And this is our Oregon brown truffle. So that's Cricket right there with her first brown truffles. And I like to tell a story of the first time she found them. I was on a foray with the North American Truffling Society. And she dug these up and I was like, oh boy, I finally get to smell what a brown truffle looks like. And I took one sniff and I was like, oh gosh, they're rotten. You know, anyone who smelled a rotten truffle is like, no, thank you. When they smell bad, they smell really bad. And so I was like, too bad. But I handed them off to the foray leaders and I was like, she found these rotten brown truffles and they gave one sniff and they're like, no, they're perfect. So that's when I learned brown truffles are not for me. They smell like, they smell rotten. They smell kind of like aged cheese, a little bit of honey in there, but they're strong. Not my kind of strong. I like to find them anyways because they're cool to find, but not to eat. Fissurella subcalis. So this one is also related to morels, oddly enough, and it has this really unique residual stipe there, which is not something you typically see with the Ascomycete truffles. This one is probably more common than we think it is, but as you can see in the picture on the right, it looks like a rock. It's pretty darn hard to find without a dog. Even the ones that Rye has found, I'll pick it up. I'm like, is this a rock or is this a truffle? Is this a rock? And then I cut it open. I'm like, oh, it's a truffle, but it feels like a rock. Okay, so that was the marbled truffles, you know, the solid ones. And we're still in the Ascomycetes, but these are the ones with folds and hollows. Starting with Genia. Genia is a beautiful truffle and it's extremely common. It's in pretty much every forest you go to around here, as long as you're in the wet season. It's with oaks and conifers. These make them look a lot bigger than they are. They are usually fingernail sized at the most, but we have a bunch of different species, a lot of undescribed species, and these have potential for culinary purposes, but they're just so small and hard to find. They haven't been really recognized for that. And then there's Geopora. This one you actually have a good chance of finding without a dog because it's commonly seen coming out of the soil. And pretty unique to this is it can still discharge its spores like above ground mushrooms do. So it still needs something to find it to kind of break open that fuzzy outer peridium, but that's a pretty unique characteristic of this one. Hydnotria, this is another really beautiful one. This I like to think of as the summer truffle because Rye finds all these different species fruiting very abundantly in the summer, even when it's starting to dry out. I do a lot of hiking in higher elevation habitats in the summer, and he'll find, I swear, hundreds of this orange one on the left. They're extraordinarily common. They like decomposing wood. The one there, the pinker one in the upper right, is a snowmelt truffle. So he usually finds that right as the snowbanks are melting up in the mountains. These can smell pretty nice too. And I like to call this the forgotten Ascomycete truffle because it is not in the Pisa azaleas. It's not in that morel cup fungi group. It's actually closely related to molds. It's one of the few members of this group that makes a fruiting body. And it's a weird one. They have this really super hard exterior, and inside is just this black powdery spore mass. So kind of like a puffball, but it doesn't puff. It needs something to come by and chew it open to release those spores. Um, I've kind of split them in these unofficial groups, the brown species and the black species. The brown ones are everywhere. Everywhere you go, Elaphomyces is incredibly abundant. And it got to the point that I was like, oh, darn, another Elaphomyces, until he started finding these black species. And these are some of the rarest truffles you can find in the Pacific Northwest. So that's how I got excited about Elaphomyces. Most of them they don't have names yet. They're new species. So to summarize, these are some of the characteristics you can expect from Ascomycete truffles. Got that solid gleba. It's kind of like a waxy texture almost. They're dense, they're classic truffles. And then there's also those with the hollows inside. And there's Elaphomyces. There are Basidiomycete truffles you can confuse for Elaphomyces with the powdery spore mass. I didn't have time to get into those, so we'll just stick with that one. So indeed, if it doesn't fit that, it's probably a Basidiomycete truffle. The Basidiomycete diversity is enormous in our area. It's really hard to quantify. You can't see one common trait in all of them, but usually they're squishier. Some of them have milk. Some of them have these like sticky, gooey locules. I'll show you some of the pictures so you can get a sense of it. So many of these truffles evolved from above ground mushroom fruiting bodies. You can kind of see in this nice illustration how you could go from a mushroom to a truffle. And I've got some pictures of my own there. That's not an actual, those aren't all the same group, but it represents the different stages of going from a mushroom to a truffle. So truffles exist in all these different groups. They've evolved many, many times. We've got truffles in the Boletales group, familiar with the king bolete, they're relatives of that. Truffles in the guild mushroom group, truffles related to coral fungi, related to Russula and Lactarius. There's even truffles related to the earth stars, and the one I'll show you looks nothing like an earth star. And I'm going to go through not based on how they're related to each other, but what common physical traits they might share if you found one and you're trying to figure out what truffle this is. So these are the truffles I call the rhizopogon-like truffles. And rhizopogon is probably the most common truffle you're going to find if you go out raking. They're super abundant and they're just kind of squishy. So the ones shown here, left to right, are rhizopogon, Hymenogastr, the Russula kind of set of truffles. And then just as a bonus, there's the really rare Lepiota one, which is just fun because it's rare. But yeah, common traits are usually squishy. We've got all these like super tiny folds, and they've got usually a really thin pyridium or no pyridium at all. Rhizopogon is really hard to tell apart if you're trying to identify at the species level. I wouldn't even recommend trying. It needs a lot of work. They can smell nice, but usually the ones I find smell pretty awful. But indeed, if you're going to go looking for truffles with a rake, you're likely to find this one. This is a list of all the different rhizopogon species in the Diversity, Ecology, and Conservation of Truffle Fungi. This kind of gives you a sense of how overwhelming it would be to try and get one of these to species. So I usually just stick with rhizopogon. Hymenogastr. This is also a really common one. If you go to like classic white truffle forest and you're raking for white truffles, you're almost certainly going to find Hymenogastr. And it has this weird like planty, radishy odor. It is not a culinary truffle, not at all. But there's actually a lot of Hymenogastr diversity in our area. So they could be interesting if you like this one. This gets kind of complicated because most of our truffles are separated into specific genera. So you can recognize like that's Hymenogastr because it's underground and it looks like a truffle. Well, most of the Russula we know are big, beautiful mushroom-looking fungi. Turns out that their truffle relatives are also in that same group. We can't distinguish them based on above ground and below ground forms. So they used to be called Gymnomyces and a bunch of others. Now we're mostly just calling them Russula. That's how it goes. They were the ones that, decided that for us. And they can look a lot like a rhizopogon. They're difficult to tell apart. They often have that weird, like sort of bruised interior, strange aroma, really hard to tell apart from the lactarius truffles, which if you find one and it bleeds milk, that's great because it's going to be lactarius. And again, this is one of those issues where it's been called Zellermyces for a very long time, may or may not still be valid, but many of the ones that I've gotten DNA sequencing on come closer to their mushroom relatives than any underground ones. And this was a fun one because Rye found it and I was like, wow, what is this beautiful blue-green little truffle? I had no idea what it was. And then the DNA sequence came back and I was like, I did not know Lepiota had a truffle variety. It does indeed. Smelled sort of like candy, bubble gum. I've only found it once, so that one was pretty fun. Okay, so that was the rhizopogon-like truffles. Then we've got this set of truffles, which have these like sticky, milky locules, they're called. Alpova, there's actually some rhizopogon that also look like this. Melanogaster is that black one. Leucogaster is white. And then my bonus truffle is Favansia, which is a very rare one, but kind of fits in this group. I think Alpova might be easier to find with a dog. I honestly don't find it very often, but I know it is a very common truffle. You can look under alders for these, actually. There's one that is an alder associate. And they have, yeah, these gooey brown locules, kind of a thin yellow peridium, usually. These are ones that you find in high elevation, Alpova trapii. And then this is actually a rhizopogon, even though it used to be called Alpova. DNA sequencing told us it was actually closer to rhizopogon. And Rye has found this in one single location, fruiting extraordinarily abundantly, but nowhere else. This is an endangered species. And one of the reasons that it's very valid as an endangered species is its habitat is greatly at risk due to forest fires. So we find this up in high elevation hemlock and fir. The one location where I has found actually very nearly burned up in the Cedar Creek fire. It was a close thing. So I was really glad to see that stuck around. This one, I fear for this one as fires get larger and more frequent in our summers. Melanogaster, this is the one I showed earlier with the black locules. Rye actually took a long time to find this. It wasn't until last summer that he found his first melanogaster, and now he finds it everywhere. It doesn't smell like a fungus. It's paint-like, it's very chemical. Some people actually like to use it to infuse. I can't imagine. I think it smells too chemical, but you can experiment with it. And then there's leucogaster, fairly common in our conifer areas. Some of these smell quite wonderful. They're like super powerful banana fruity truffles. I have not personally eaten them, but you could give it a try. And then this is another truffle endangered species. We found this 3 locations last summer. Again, this habitat that you worry a little about, the increase of forest fires. I don't know exactly if it's quite as rare as people originally thought, or it's just hard to find a dog. But this one, it also has kind of a weird, it's sort of like a gluey banana smell. Maybe not quite as, it's related to leucogaster, probably not as high in culinary potential. Okay, and then there's these truffles, which they don't always have it, but they have like this central structure which comes out from the center and expands towards the edges, usually somewhat translucent. It's called a columella. And the groups that you commonly see it in are Histrangium on the left, Gaudiaria in the middle, and then I just added Sclerogaster in here. It's very uncommon, but it fit, and it does have a little columella. So Histrangium you can usually identify by that greenish interior, different shades of green, and that sort of gooey central columella coming out. And these often melt into green goo and age. Sometimes Rye will dig it up and there's no truffle. It's just like this mess of green goo, which is another way to disperse your spores. If nothing finds you by the time that you're mature, you just melt into goo and it's more likely to move through the soil. really strong, generally awful aroma on these. I don't love to find them. Same with this one. When they're young and nice, they can actually smell very nice. The first one we found smelled like banana bread. I was like, wow, banana bread truffle. And then as the season goes on, they start smelling worse and worse. This is the burnt rubber gasoline truffle. And it's incredibly pungent. You don't want to keep this in your car. Or your refrigerator. It'll infuse everything. It's awful. And very difficult to identify the species. There's a lot of undescribed species for this one. Most of them have just been called Yadiuria monticola, but there's a lot in there that's not that. And then there's finally our little teeny sclerogaster. All these other truffles I've shown you are almost certainly hosted by trees and supporting the trees by finding nutrients in the soil. This one is not. This is the one that's actually related to Earth stars, believe it or not. Doesn't look anything like an Earth star, but it doesn't grow with trees. It's probably just a little decomposer truffle. I found it in prairies, actually, and it's pea-sized, and it may be small, but it has a mighty aroma. This one smells kind of like a combination of lemon bar, aluminum, and egg, oddly enough. I mean, I struggled to like come up with words for it, but that was the closest we could get. And this is a new species, and hopefully I'll be describing this one at some point. It was a very exciting find because you don't expect to find truffles in grasslands. So that's kind of summarizing the Basidiomycete truffle characteristics. It is hard to generalize because they've evolved so many times from so many different groups. So it's incredibly broad. But usually the squishiness, gooiness, seeing that remnant stipe or columella, you can assume it's probably a Basidiomycete truffle. So all in all, how many genera has Rye found? So far about 35. There's probably a couple more in there, but lots of Basidiomycetes, a good number of Ascomycetes, and this other group that I didn't get into, but he's quite broad. So I just want to say, I'm still an amateur. I've learned about truffles because Rye is finding them, and I'm curious what they are, but I'm not a mycologist yet. I don't know everything I'm talking about, and so many people have supported me in my truffle journey. I can't name all of them, but it's been wonderful to be supported the way I am with my wonderful dog. And with that, okay. So for Zoom folks, the question is ideal season for truffles. Usually about a month after the first fall rains is when you're going to find the highest truffle diversity. Now, culinary truffles, the season is actually peaking right about now. They usually have an early fall flush around October, November, and then it kind of slows down and it really picks up January and February. And the black truffles are probably going to peak in March. They come on a little bit later, but you can find truffles year round as long as you go to somewhere where the soil is at least not rock hard. You know, the one time I do not find truffles is, in the valley in the middle of summer. It's just too dry. But yeah, go to high elevation, once the snow melts, that's their season, But culinary wise, right now is a great. Okay, question about truffle dog oils. I started with a combination of black and white truffles from a truffle dog company in Seattle because I didn't have access to truffles. It's going to be a little bit easier for the dog to generalize to wild truffles if you use frozen or fresh pieces, but you don't have to. The oil works well. I would try to get one of our native truffles because you can get European culinary varieties. That is going to be a bigger leap for the dog to make from that to ours, but they do sell. They sell our native culinaries as truffle dog training oil. You get that, yeah. Okay, so the question is about assessing truffles based on their aroma. I would say when Rye first started finding truffles, I was pretty much guaranteed to get a really nice, strong truffle. As he's gotten really, really good, he'll find truffles that are just starting to make aroma, and they probably wouldn't be the best, for selling to, commercial kitchens and stuff. I don't hunt truffles commercially. I don't sell, But usually if a dog finds it, it is going to be either peak or past. They don't usually find them unripe, right as occasionally. But yeah, you know, if you smell it, pretty much all dog found truffles have a really strong, lovely aroma, or they smell absolutely terrible because the dogs like them when they're rotting too, and we don't. Yeah, Ryan will sometimes find rotten black truffle. And I'm like, do I reward him or not? I mean, I don't know. But they do, there's a lot of ranges too. The black truffles especially. They have a fair amount of range. There's some question about what bacterial partners could also be there helping produce aroma. All these different components might explain some of the variability you get from the different ones. I think they're probably the best when they first come out of the soil. And then you wash them, you clean them up, you stick them in the fridge. And when they're enclosed in a container, when you first open it, they'll have a really nice strong smell. And the longer you have them out sniffing them, they might start smelling a little more mushroomy. But yeah, that's how I prefer truffles just as an infusion. I don't usually eat them, but when you just stick them next to any kind of fatty food, you know, butter, eggs, you'll just get those, you know, pure fragrant compounds. When you shave it and you get a little bit more of the mushroomy kind of stuff. So it just depends on what you like. The question is, if Rye gets disgusted by anything he smells, you know, the fact he took so long to find melanogaster makes me think he maybe doesn't like it. And that one is exceptionally chemically. Now, the nastier and the more rotted the truffle, no, because he's a dog and dogs like nasty rotting things. So that's not a problem. But the more chemical, less fungal smells, I think probably a few of those he doesn't like. You know, he'll get attracted to it because he thinks, oh, this will get me my ball, but he's not naturally inclined to enjoy them. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you take your dog out to the woods, you say search, you know, or start. I mean, is there a cue that you give them to say you're looking for truffles versus
Yeah.
they were longer?
Right. Okay. So the question is about cues for whether I cue the dog to find the truffles. Rye's cue is either the word truffle. He does know that if I go to a specific spot in the woods, I'm like, this could be a good place. I'll tell him to truffle. If I just pull off the side of the road and jump into a bunch of forest, he immediately starts looking for, because that's just what we do. Same thing on a trail. He switches between being a dog, just running around sniffing dog smells. And if he's inspired, if he smells a truffle, he'll pursue it for me, but he's not always sniffing. The other cue is, of course, if I show him his ball, he'll be like, oh, now we're finding truffles. This is his other cue. Someone's looking for a truffle dog trainer. I know the Truffle Dog Company does classes. They're based in Seattle. They definitely know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a long time. They may or may not also have online classes. I'm not sure. I wish I could tell you specifically. Yeah, NATS, the North American Truffling Society, occasionally does truffle dog training sessions. I don't know if they've done any recently, but it's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, there's the truffle dog competition is coming up in like 2 weeks, maybe? I can't remember, but it's called the Joriad and it's at the Lane County Fairgrounds. I've never actually been because I sadly sold some truffles. I know when I was going to enter my dog and they don't let you enter if you've ever sold truffles. So I was disqualified before I even got started, but that's okay. But I've heard it's a really fun thing to watch and probably a way to connect with trainers, I think. Go ahead.
Curious about the potential for truffle dogs to discover really novel truffle diversity. Are there examples either here in Europe previously unknown ordinary truffles were discovered or really genetically distant truffle species?
I don't. Oh, sorry. So the question is about using dogs to find really distinct species here versus in Europe. I don't know as much about what they've done in Europe. They did use dogs a lot for the initial discovery of many of these species, unlike North America where we haven't. I mean, a lot of the truffles Rye finds, they're not completely unknown, as in they're not new genera necessarily, but he finds lots of new species all the time. Whether they have culinary potential or not, unlikely. There are some tubers that he finds in the oaks that I think could have culinary potential, but I've shown them to a fair number of people and they're like, oh, that's weird. So it might just be me. Culinary wise, I don't think there's that much potential for dogs to find new ones, but there's a huge amount of potential for finding new species. My goal with Rye is to eventually find a new truffle genus. We'll see if that happens. It could. I mean, they're small and they're hard to find, so that's my hope. Okay, so the question is whether it's potentially dangerous to use truffles that you don't know the history of to infuse butter. No, there's never. You might feel sick from the the horrible aroma you're eating, but no, it's never going to be dangerous. You could infuse with anything you find. The dangerous, whether or not if you actually eat the physical truffle, you might be, there might be some risk, but infusing is completely safe. Yeah, you can always. Okay, so question about which dog breed is best truffle hunter? Yeah. And breeds you wouldn't try. Okay, so first part is there is actually a breed of dog that is bred to find truffles. It's called the Lagotto. It's an Italian breed. You see those actually, they're getting pretty popular around here because we've got truffles and people are like, oh, truffle dogs. So I've heard they're pretty good. Whether they're actually better than any other dog, I don't know for sure, because it all comes down to whether you've got a motivated dog. They all have good noses. And yeah, dogs that I wouldn't use for truffle hunting, probably like sight hounds, things that aren't, things you can't motivate either with a ball or food. Dogs that want to work independently, they're just hard to train. Actually, there's a very successful pug truffle dog. Yeah, he was actually a diversity dog. Yeah. So, but a lot of it comes down to the individual, Most pugs, no, definitely not suited. And then now that you get one that wants to work with you or is super motivated, and yeah, I think it's a lot more on the individual basis than breed, honestly. Oh, no, actually, one year a Chihuahua won the truffle dog competition. So you never know. You never know. Okay, so question about the timing of training. Do you start with a puppy or wait until they're older? I've heard different opinions. Some people say you should wait until they're more mature. Other people say, start as soon as they come out of the womb, introduce those tiny, tiny puppies to the truffle smell. I think that's a lot of what they do in Europe, actually. They do start them very, very young. I think the danger of starting too young is putting too much pressure on the dog. It never hurts to introduce the aroma. Whether you actually start asking them to find the truffle, you need to be more careful. Like with my puppy, I did in-house training where it specifically was like find the truffle, et cetera, et cetera. When I take him out in the woods, I might tell Rye to search an area, but I don't ask my puppy for that. I let him, if he finds a truffle, I pursue it with him, I reward him, but I let him be a puppy, because that's what he's going to do. If you put too much pressure on them, they stop thinking it's fun, and you risk losing that spark. Back when I first trained cricket, I bought it from the Truffle Dog Company. Yeah, they're in Seattle. And they do our culinary truffles infused in oil.
Truffles or
Truffle oil. Yeah. Yeah.
Or is it, so there's real truffle oil and then there's truffle oil that's basically made from chemicals that. Especially if you're looking at the European culinary truffles, a lot of it is made in a lab. It's not actually infused with real truffles. I don't know anything about how the Truffle Dog Company makes their oil, but I assume they're just infusing with actual truffles. And yeah, they use our native culinary truffles, which smell completely different than the European ones. So in terms of making that picture clear for your dog, I would stick with native truffle oil. Infusing, actually doing your own oil infusion. I've never infused oil. I infuse butter all the time because that's my favorite way to enjoy truffles.
The main thing about, if you're going to infuse with truffles, you have to make sure the truffle stays fresh. So open that container every day. If it starts looking damp at all, you need to pat it down with a paper towel. Just, maintenance. Truffles last anywhere from a few days to maybe over a week in, peak condition in the refrigerator, and then they start going bad. So you do have, it is a very sensitive creature when you keep it in the fridge. But yeah, just as long as it's in a tight enclosed container, it will infuse anything fatty, without a doubt. How long that lasts in the oil kind of depends. It may not stick around. When I infuse butter, I usually try to put it in the freezer after it's done infusing, because freezer seems to keep it for a little while longer. It doesn't stay forever. But yeah, if you just put some oil in a jar, make a little, truffle hammock with a paper towel or a tea ball, close it up. As long as it's sealed, leave it in for a few days. You will have some truffle flavor in that oil for sure.
As long as the truffle is surrounded by oil.
Yeah, that is one note. Don't immerse the truffle in anything. You actually can risk things like bacterial contamination and botulism, I believe, too. You want to watch out sticking things in oil. Somewhat risky.
Yeah, you know, if the Oregon truffle, the black and the white, has any manufacturer esters from these?
So your question is whether you can actually produce it on a commercial scale or? Oh, no. Yeah, I don't think they have done that for the Oregon truffles yet. I think, they're still getting on the culinary market. They're still gaining a reputation. So far, we haven't really broken into the European market, which obviously dominates most of the truffle products around here. I think it will be some time before people start actually chemically dissecting them. So far, it seems easier. Yeah. Yeah. And, the European ones are, at least triple the value of ours, I would say. At least the really top ones, it fluctuates which species you're looking at. And, honestly, ours have a huge amount of potential. It's been difficult getting them on the market because of how many have been sold to restaurants immature, has really damaged their reputation, which is why a lot of the, the folks in the culinary scene are really pushing only dog found truffles, trying to get the reputation back up, because they really do. They are definitely on the same playing field as the European truffles. They just haven't had the right treatment in the past. Don't assume that's what they smell like. I've seen rotting black truffles. They're so fragile. They're really hard to keep.
But as we said, truffles have a lifespan after they get harvested, and the fragrance deteriorates over time and changes.
Especially if you don't keep them dry.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
truffle. I've heard instructions. I'm not a super patient. I can smell truffles, but when black truffles are fresh, they kind of a fruity.
I have some with me, if people want to smell them. I brought some truffles.